All right, guys, the recording has started. So, let me share screen there. So there were some kind of technical issues with getting this meeting started a second ago. I hope everyone's here that wants to be here. And so, first things first, so we're going to continue our discussion on inheritance today. So first quote of the day, Thomas Edison is attributed as saying, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." And it supposedly was stated after he had been unable to produce a light bulb after thousands of tries, but then finally was able to produce it. If you want a long explanation as to why Thomas Edison should not be attributed, should not be considered the father of the light bulb, my son will be glad to tell you. But I did want to go over a few things on the inheritance slides here with our time today. So one of the things during yesterday's discussion when we were implementing a child class, and we talked about, oh, you know what, I put that one slide too late. Okay, I said the two-string method was one that we should override. Someone also mentioned the equals method being one that we had to override. Now, neither the two-string method nor the equals method is required to be overridden. Right? It exists in the object class so that all objects have it, but that doesn't mean that we have to override it. We can just use the existing equals method that exists in the object class. We can just use the existing two-string method that exists in the object class. All right. By default, equals method, if we don't override it, what happens is it receives an object. We can pass it any object. So we could pass it a string, we could pass it a student, we could pass it anything, right? And it returns, does this, the current object I'm looking at, match the object that's being passed by reference? So it's saying, is this pointing to the exact same thing, right? That's by default, it does that. Now we know from practice that when we use the equals method on a string object, it must not do this. It must have been overridden in the string class, because it checks, do the two strings have the same value? It doesn't check, do they point to the same thing? It checks, do they have the same value? So for an example of how we would override the equals method is we could do something like this. So if O is instance of circle, if the object being passed is instance of circle, okay, well, let's go to the else first. What does else mean? Else means, how will we get into else? What must be the case if we get to the else part of this? No one? Good show. Okay. Right, if O is not an instant circle, it could be anything. It could be a string, it could be a rectangle, it could be an object, just an object, right? If it's anything besides the circle or its subclasses, good point, Conberg. All right, we'll get in, yeah. But if it's anything else, we return false. So what we're saying is if they don't match the type, if it's not also a circle, they can't be equal, okay? Otherwise, if it is a circle, we check the radius. Does the radius, right, of my current object, is it the same value, an integer? Is it the same double. Is it the same value as that object I passed? I can cast it to a circle because it is an instance of circle. Is it have the same radius value? Okay. By the way, this would not be a good programming practice in my opinion, because, let me explain very quickly, because here we have given the circle object here direct access to the radius parameter, to the radius attribute. Not a good idea, right? We don't make our attributes public, right? We make our methods public to access the private attributes, right? Okay, I'm not saying it's wrong, and I'm not saying you can't do that, but what I am saying is that is generally good practice is to do it that way. All right. We will talk about in future weeks about how some of these other things, like how do we check it? Who do we say if one is greater than the other? Like, what if you have a rectangle and a circle and you want to put them in order, one greater than the other? How do you check that? How do you say which one's greater? We can say they're not equal because one's a rectangle and one's a circle, but how do you say if one of them is greater than the other? And we'll talk about examples and options for that in a future week. Okay. Again, the equals comparison operator checks directly do the reference, the objects, the variables reference the exact same object. All right, so that's why we override or can override the equals method. Okay. We did also talk about the array list, but again, we talked a little bit about that. Let me see, what was that? There was one other thing in here I wanted to. Okay, yeah, and here again we talk about the different how things are accessed, right? So things accessed from the same class. Any variable, any attribute, any method can be accessed from the class in which it is. All right. Generally speaking, again, this one and this one are the two that we use most often. Right. Let's see, where are we? Right, and then we did also talk about the final modifier as well, of how that is used to not allow a class to be extended, to a variable is constant, and a final method cannot be overridden by its subclasses. Make sure that you know the difference between a overriding and overloading. So overriding is taking an existing method in a parent class and changing its implementation. Overloading is taking a method that has the same name, right? That has the same name and giving it a different implementation. So like a different parameter list, a different return value, something like that. So it becomes a separate method entirely. Right. So like an example. Okay. So let's see, where was my example of this? Right, so you had two different implementations for the constructor for person, right? Two different implementations for that constructor for person, one that takes no parameter, one that takes a single string parameter, right? So that was an example of a overloading, so an overloading the constructor, right? Oh, so some of you may have noticed that there was an announcement. All right, so you have 45 minutes to take the quiz that's on the general channel. All right, so we will end our discussion for today there. I will leave this meeting open for anybody. If you have a question, you can type it into the chat, but should not take you 45 minutes to do the quiz. All right, Thank you, guys. Once you finish the quiz, you may exit the meeting, and have a good weekend.